Let's see about the types of verses. Ballad. Ballad is a narrative poem originally transmitted orally and dealt with religious themes, love, tragedy, domestic crimes, and sometimes even political propaganda. The folk ballad tells a compact little story that begins eruptively at the moment when the narrative has turned decisively toward its catastrophe or resolution. Focusing on a single climatic situation, the ballad does not elaborate the beginning of the conflict and the setting. Characterization is minimal, the characters themselves revealing in their actions or speeches. Over moral comment on the character's behavior is suppressed and the motivation seldom explicitly detailed. The literary ballad is a narrative poem created by a poet in imitation of the old anonymous folk ballad. Usually, the literary ballad is more elaborate and complex. The poet may retain only some of the devices and conventions of the older verse narrative. Literary ballads were quite popular in England during the 19th century. The second type is an epic. An epic is a long verse narrative on a serious subject, told in a formal and elevated style and centered on a heroic or quasi-divine figure on whose actions depends the fate of a tribe, a nation, or a human race. Traditional or folk epics or primary epics were written versions of what had originally been oral poems about a tribal or national hero during a warlike age. Literary epics were composed by individual poetic craftsmen in deliberate imitation of the traditional form. There are some conventions followed by epics. The narrator begins by stating his argument or epic theme, invokes muse or guiding spirit to inspire him in his great undertaking, then addresses to the muse the epic question, the answer to which inaugurates the narrative power. The second one is the narrative starts in the middle of things at a critical point in the action. The third type is there are catalogs or some of the principal characters introduced in formal detail. The third type is free verse. Free verse or verse libre is the technique of using irregular cadences in poetry or the recurrence with variations of phrases, images, and syntactical patterns rather than the conventional use of meter. It emerged in modernist poetry as a predominant practice and is often said to be derived from practices of 19th century. French poets such as Gustave Kahn and Jules Lefort, as well as Rimbaud, Wilde Griffin, and others. Rhyme may or may not be present in free verse, but when it is used with great freedom. In conventional verse, the unit is the foot or the line. In free verse, the units are larger, sometimes being paragraphs or strophes. The next one is a mock epic. A mock epic or mock heroic poem imitates the elaborate form and ceremonious style of the epic genre, but applies it to a commonplace or trivial subject matter. The Battle of the Frogs of Aristophanes is a Greek parody of the Iliad. In a masterpiece of this type, The Rape of the Lock, Pope views through the grandiose epic perspective a quarrel between the belles and elegance of his day over the theft of a lady's curl. The story includes such elements of traditional epic protocol as supernatural machinery, a voyage aboard a ship, a visit to the underworld, and highly dramatic episodes, one of which is the Rape of the Lock. Pope also presents a heroically scaled battle between the sexes, but in the battle, hatpins and snuff take the place of weapons. Homeric scenes of battle are imitated in the card game of Omber and in the mock fights between the lords and ladies. Another example is the Toilet of Belinda, which is represented as a mystic religious rite in classical fashion. Thus, in a mock epic, a trivial incident is clothed in the traditional paraphernalia and solemn dignity of the epic form. The term is also applied to other dignified poetic forms which are purposefully mismatched to a lowly subject. For example, Thomas Gray's Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat The mock epic was popular in the 18th century because of the predominance of the satirical mode in 18th century literature and as a reaction against the failure of the epic in the previous century, such as Abraham Cowley's David Days and the Civil War. The next type is an ode. The ode is a lyric poem of moderate length with a serious subject, an elevated style, and an elaborate stanza pattern. The ode often praises people, the arts of music and poetry, nasal scenes, or abstract concepts. Forms of odes include the Pindaric ode, written to celebrate public events such as Olympic Games, and the Horatian ode, which are intimate and reflective. Abraham Cowley developed the irregular ode. Both Horatian and Pindaric forms were revived during the Renaissance and transformed by the Romantic poets into a meditative and private as well as historical genre. The next one is pastoral poetry. The pastoral poem is modeled on Theocritus, Virgil, and other classical masters and elevates the life of the shepherd or shepherdess versus the evils of the city. Depicting an idealized, almost utopian view of rural life, it deals with topics like death, love, the mockery of politics, and the ideal life of the country. The pastoral elegy begins with an expression of grief and an invocation to the muse to aid the poet in expressing his suffering. It usually contains a funeral procession, a description of sympathetic mourning throughout the nature, and musings on the unkindness of death. It ends with acceptance, often a very affirmative justification of nature's law. The next type is a sonnet. A sonnet is a 14-line lyric poem traditionally written in iambic pentameter that is in lines 10 syllables long with accents falling on every second syllable, as in "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day" of Shakespeare. The sonnet form first became popular during the Italian Renaissance when the poet Petrarch published a sequence of love sonnets addressed to an idealized woman named Laura. Taking firm hold among Italian poets, the sonnet spread throughout Europe to England, where, after its initial renaissance, Petrarchan incarnation faded, the form enjoyed a number of revivals and periods of renewed interest. In Elizabethan England, the era during which Shakespeare's sonnets were written, the sonnet was a form of choice for lyric poets, particularly lyric poets seeking to engage with traditional themes of love and romance. Sonnets were also written during the height of classical English verse by Dryden and Pope, among others, and written again during the heyday of English Romanticism when Wordsworth, Shelley, and particularly John Keats created wonderful sonnets. Today, the sonnet remains the most influential and important verse form in the history of English poetry. Two kinds of sonnets have been most common in English poetry, and they take their names from the great poets to utilize them: the Petrarchan sonnet and the Shakespearean sonnet. The Petrarchan sonnet is divided into two main parts called the octave and sestet. The octave is 8 lines long and typically follows a rhyme scheme ABBA, ABBA, or ABBA, CDDC. The sestet occupies the remaining 6 lines of the poem and typically follows a rhyme scheme of CD, CCDC, or CDE, CDE. The octave and sestet are usually contrasted in some key way. For example, the octave may ask a question to which the sestet offers an answer. The Shakespearean sonnet, the form of sonnet utilized throughout Shakespeare's sequence, is divided into 4 parts. The first 3 parts are each 4 lines long and are known as quatrains, rhymed AB. The fourth part is called the couplet and is rhymed CC. The Shakespearean sonnet is often used to develop a sequence of metaphors or ideas, one in each quatrain, while the couplet offers either a summary or a new take on the preceding images or ideas. In many ways, Shakespeare's use of the sonnet form is richer and more complex than this relatively simple division into parts might imply. Not only is the sequence largely occupied with subverting the traditional themes of love sonnets, the traditional love poems in praise of beauty and worth, for instance, are written to a man, while the love poems to a woman are almost all bitter and negative. He also combines formal patterns with daring and innovation.